The midnight train was still 2 miles from Mercy Ridge when the scream came from the last passenger car. By the time the conductor reached the compartment, the girl was dead. Her name was Evelyn Hart, a 22-year-old schoolteacher traveling west to begin a new life. She had been found beside the window, her small travel bag on the floor and a silver locket still clenched in her hand. Outside, the Wyoming plains disappeared beneath a cold November storm. Nobody in the train knew why she had been killed, but one passenger did. His name was Jonah Reed, and he was terrified. Jonah sat alone in the corner of the next car, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He was a thin, weather-beaten cowboy in his early 30s, with a scar across his cheek and hands that shook. Whenever he thought about the sound he had heard before the scream, he had seen the killer, and he knew that if he spoke, he might be the next man to die. When the train finally stopped at Mercy Ridge, Sheriff Thomas Hale climbed aboard with 2 deputies. Every passenger was questioned. Jonah said nothing. He claimed he had been asleep. The sheriff studied him for several seconds. "You sure about that?" Jonah nodded. "Yes, sir." It was the first lie he had told in years. Evelyn's body was carried from the train beneath a wool blanket. Jonah watched from the window. Then he saw something that made his blood turn cold. A tall man in a black coat stood beside the station office. He wasn't looking at the dead girl. He was looking directly at Jonah. Jonah recognized him. Caleb Voss, the richest cattle buyer in 3 counties, and the man Jonah had spent the last 6 months trying to forget. The next morning, Sheriff Hale visited every passenger from the train. When he reached Jonah's small rented room above the blacksmith shop, Jonah opened the door and found the sheriff holding Evelyn's silver locket. "This was found near your seat," Hale said. Jonah stared at it. "That isn't mine." "I know. Then why bring it here?" "Because there is a name inside." Hale opened the locket. A tiny photograph showed Evelyn standing beside an older woman. On the back were 4 words. "Tell Jonah the truth." Jonah's face went pale. The sheriff noticed. "You knew her." Jonah slowly sat down. "Not well. But she knew you." Jonah looked toward the window. "She knew who I was." "That isn't the same thing." Jonah finally whispered. "She was looking for me." The sheriff waited. Jonah remembered 3 nights earlier, when Evelyn had approached him at the station in Cheyenne. She had asked if he was Jonah Reed. When he confirmed it, she had handed him a folded piece of paper. "My father trusted you," she had said. Jonah had not understood. Her father, Samuel Hart, had once worked as a bookkeeper for Caleb Voss. Then Samuel had disappeared. Jonah had known why. He had been there the night it happened. But before Jonah could ask another question, Evelyn had whispered something that frightened him. "My father wasn't a thief." Then she had walked away. Jonah had followed her onto the train. He had planned to speak with her. Instead, he had seen Caleb Voss enter the rear car. And later that night, Jonah had seen Voss standing outside Evelyn's compartment. He had heard voices, then a struggle, then silence. Jonah had wanted to help, but fear had stopped him. Years earlier, Jonah had worked for Voss on his cattle operation. He had discovered that Voss was stealing land from struggling ranchers using forged deeds and false debts. When Jonah threatened to expose him, Voss had beaten him and warned that his younger brother would disappear if Jonah went to the sheriff. Jonah had stayed silent. His brother had died the following winter anyway. Since then, Jonah had carried the guilt like a stone inside his chest. Sheriff Hale leaned forward. "Jonah, what did you see?" Jonah closed his eyes. "I saw Caleb Voss outside her compartment." The sheriff stood. "Then why didn't you say that last night?" "Because Voss doesn't threaten people. He destroys them." Hill's expression hardened. Maybe he has finally met someone who won't be afraid. But before they could leave, a gunshot echoed from the street. The sheriff ran outside. Jonah followed. Across the road, an old freight wagon was burning. Inside it were the belongings of one of the train passengers. A warning. The sheriff looked at Jonah. "Voss knows you talked." Jonah shook his head. "I only told you." Hale looked toward the courthouse. "Then someone else is listening." That afternoon, the sheriff searched Evelyn's luggage. Inside her Bible was a folded railway map. Several towns had been marked in red. Beside Mercy Ridge was one handwritten word: Ledger. Jonah understood immediately. Evelyn had not been killed because she was simply traveling west. She had been carrying evidence. The 2 men followed the map to an abandoned freight depot outside town. Beneath a loose floorboard, they found a tin box. Inside were copies of land deeds, payment records, and letters bearing Voss's signature. But there was one document that changed everything. It was a confession written by Samuel Hart. He had discovered that Voss had been buying ranches with forged papers. Samuel had copied the records and planned to expose him. Before he could, Voss had threatened his family. Samuel had disappeared soon afterward. At the bottom of the confession was a final sentence. If anything happens to me, Evelyn will know where the proof is. Jonah stared at the papers. She knew. Hale nodded. And someone knew she had them. A slow clap came from the doorway. Caleb Voss stepped inside. Two armed men stood behind him. Voss looked almost amused. You should have stayed afraid, Jonah. The sheriff reached for his pistol, but one of the men knocked it from his hand. Voss walked toward Jonah. You had a chance to disappear. Jonah's hands trembled. You killed Evelyn. Voss's expression changed. She should have minded her own business. For years, Jonah had imagined the moment when he would finally face Caleb Voss. He had imagined anger, revenge, a gunfight. Instead, he felt something different. He felt tired. Tired of being afraid. Voss reached for the tin box. Jonah stepped in front of him. You're not taking it. Voss laughed. You think a frightened cowboy can stop me? Jonah looked at Sheriff Hale, then at the papers, then toward the doorway. He heard footsteps, dozens of them. The townspeople had gathered outside. Word had spread about Evelyn's murder. The station master, the blacksmith, the ranchers Voss had cheated, even the families whose land had been stolen. They stood together in the street. Sheriff Hale slowly rose. You heard him confess. Voss turned toward the doorway. For the first time, fear crossed his face. One of his men lowered his weapon. The other followed. Voss realized he was alone. He tried to escape through the back, but Jonah caught him at the door. The two men struggled briefly before Voss fell against the wall. Jonah could have struck him. Instead, he stepped back. No more, Jonah said. Sheriff Hale placed handcuffs on Voss. The trial lasted several months. The land records proved everything. Voss was convicted for fraud, conspiracy, and Evelyn Hart's murder. The ranches he had stolen were returned to their rightful owners. But justice could not bring Evelyn back. On the first warm morning of spring, the people of Mercy Ridge gathered at the small cemetery outside town. A simple wooden marker stood beneath a cottonwood tree. Evelyn Hart, teacher, daughter, courageous friend. Jonah stood alone beside it. He placed her silver locket beneath the marker. Sheriff Hale approached quietly. You could keep it. Jonah shook his head. It belonged to her. Hale looked across the valley. You saved a lot of people. Jonah stared at Evelyn's grave. She saved them. How? She was brave enough to come back for the truth. The sheriff smiled faintly. And you? Jonah looked toward the distant mountains. I was afraid. Hale waited. Jonah continued. But being afraid isn't the same as being a coward. That evening, Jonah returned to his small ranch outside Mercy Ridge. For the first time, he left the front door unlocked. He looked across the fields as the sunset turned the grass gold. For years, he had believed courage meant having no fear. Evelyn had taught him something different. Courage was hearing fear whisper in your ear and choosing to speak anyway. And somewhere beyond the mountains, the midnight train continued its journey west, carrying strangers toward new beginnings. But every time its whistle echoed through Mercy Ridge, Jonah remembered the girl who had boarded that train seeking the truth and found the courage to leave it behind for everyone else.